Do we have Eden in the room?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. We have about 20 participants now, so we can start the session. I would like to ask all participants to mute. Okay, so I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Aidan Fenta. I'm the country manager for the Africa Clean Energy Technical Assistance Facility. For those of you that know, this is FCDO funded program. We've been on the ground for a year and a half, working closely with the Ministry of Water, Irrigation and Energy. We've been providing a number of technical assistance facilities here in Ethiopia, including issues related to quality assurance, fiscal incentives, access to finance, and energy nexus. Today, one of our projects on access to finance is our investment map report, which we are developing jointly with the Shell Foundation program called Ethiopian Energy Market Accelerator. This report was recently published, and the report highlights the key investment flows in the off-grid standalone solar sector, what are the key challenges and intervention areas. So I'll start this session by handing over to Joe, who is one of the lead consultants from the Open Capital Advisors, to give a very quick presentation on the key findings from the investment map report. Joe, over to you.
Thank you, Eden. Should I share the screen from my end?
Since the year 1450, the written word has poured humanity.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you, Eden, for that introduction. Sorry, 1 second. All right.
It was reported that more than 400 million pieces of plastic.
Thank you for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Chirunji. I'm an associate with Open Capital, and I was supporting the A staff and EMA teams with the assessment of the investment landscape for standalone solar in Ethiopia. As part of that work, we developed a report that details the state of investment into standalone solar, or SAS, the barriers to investment, looking at the supply, demand, and policy side dynamics to those, and which also discusses recommendations for intervention to accelerate investment. So today I'll just highlight the key summary insights from that assessment before handing back over to Eden, but the full report, as she said, is also available for review. So just quickly running through I think, yeah, we've already run through this, so I'll just jump right into the first slide. And please let me know if the screen pops off for any reason. Starting off with the state of investment, we estimate that approximately 51.7 million US dollars has been deployed by investors to support standalone solar companies between 2012 and 2019, and that an additional 140 million US dollars has been committed since last year in 2020 under the country's national electrification plan, which is looking to achieve 100% electrification by 2025 through a combination of 65% grid connections and 35% off-grid. The Ministry of Energy estimated that 1.76 billion US dollars in funding is needed for the off-grid component specifically, which equates to about 9.2 million new off-grid connections. So that $52 million disbursed has been primarily from the World Bank's $45 million credit facility called the Market Development Credit Line, which has become somewhat of a case study for successful investment intervention into Ethiopia. In fact, new funding that has been committed through the African Development Bank, and again through the World Bank and another program called the DEL, based on the structure of these financing mechanisms, seem to be largely based on MDCL and the learnings that came out of that. I think it's worth noting that the exact funding allocation under DEL has not been officially announced, at least not to our knowledge. And also the AFDB facility rollout and funding was disrupted by COVID-19, and so it's unclear whether it will remain at the initially announced figure of 100 million. And then there's also been some grant funding through the AECF REACT household facility of 6.7 million US dollars. So looking at, in the report that we published with EMA, we looked a little bit more specifically at the MDCL. We looked at it in a fair amount of detail, given its contribution to almost 90% of known investment into the SAS sector. It was funded by IDA, the International Development Association, which is a World Bank fund and administered by the Development Bank of Ethiopia. The facility is a targeted response to a specific set of needs in the market. Ethiopia being a large country with many remotely located and dispersed communities, in order to reach those unserved and often low-income households, companies have to invest in extending their supply chain and other market infrastructure while finding ways to subsidize the costs of their products. There's also virtually no SAS manufacturing industry, so the sector is quite heavily dependent on imports, and all of this creates a large demand for forex to finance imports, for working capital to support distribution, and also for consumer financing options to enable uptake by households. And so the MDCL responds to a lot of these needs through two financing windows. One, private sector enterprise revolving fund that SAS companies can apply to for forex loans and then make repayments in local Ethiopian currency with guaranteed access for up to 2 years. And then a consumer financing facility that allows participating enterprise to apply for local currency wholesale loans financed by those repayments from the revolving fund. This facility was deployed across 2 phases, with a collateral support facility included in phase 2 that guaranteed up to 75% of the loan amount for smaller companies. So on the left-hand side, we can see that the cumulative loans to companies in 2018 amounted to $18 million, and then for MFIs amounted to 16.5 million, again through that revolving fund mechanism. And if we break that down by technology, about 3/4 of it financed the distribution of solar home systems in phase 2, and this was a prescribed allocation to encourage uptake of home systems, since in the previous phase 1, an overwhelming majority of the funding went towards solar lanterns. And then the remaining funding was spread out across various technical assistance activities. So when we look at the factors constraining investment into the sector, on the supply side, we see restrictions around forex, which is that question that has been coming up a lot. With companies dependent on imports, they require forex to support those international purchases and shipments. But the National Bank of Ethiopia has some restrictions around possession and use of forex, foreign currencies and transactions. The lending environment can also be quite unfavorable because of that working capital need that we talked about earlier. Companies rely on the commercial sector for local currency debt, but loans are hard to acquire, given the share of SME lending in Ethiopia being quite low at only 7% compared to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, and with interest and collateral rates also being fairly high. Local banks also tend to prioritize businesses that are engaged in export, which doesn't favor an import-heavy industry like SAS. There's also been an issue of unsuitable financing structures, whether that's the time to approval for forex loans or the consistency of supply of forex to support import activities. So that's on the supply side, specifically, restricting the supply of investment. On the demand side, we see constraints stemming from government restrictions around vertical integration, which is the ability of retailers to exercise control over multiple parts of the supply chain. This ultimately restricts scalability, since companies are only able to build a minimal level of experience across the supply chain, which limits growth and the ability to absorb larger ticket sizes of funding. The fragmented supply chain also has limited adoption of installment-based payment mechanisms like PayGo, which in other markets has proven to be most successfully implemented within an integrated system. And then there are also implications around product prices for end users, because if companies are forced to add markups, since an additional layer of cost is incurred at each point along the supply chain, that's ultimately going to affect the end user price. And then, all of this is also on that second point, on the demand side, compounded by low consumer ability and or willingness to pay, and also design gaps within consumer financing mechanisms. For example, under the MDCL facility, MFIs could lend to households at rates as high as 25%, which in our conversations with DB is more than twice the rate at which they borrow. And yet DB actually bears the full risk of loans for MFIs. And then lastly, on the policy side, restrictions around mobile money services, specifically NB's restrictions on issuance of payments instruments by non-bank entities, which limits PayGo. And companies who want to adopt PayGo have also cited challenges around acquiring financing licenses, which are required now on top of distribution licenses. There's also been inconsistent application of tax exemptions. Companies are reporting they can pay anywhere between 0% to 35% in customs duty for the same technology. And similarly, an inadequate enforcement of quality standards, which has flooded the market with uncertified and sometimes cheaply produced products that affects consumer confidence in the sector. I think in 2016, from the report, only 40% of solar lanterns and 20% of solar kits coming into the market were reported to be quality approved. So there have been a number of initiatives, past and ongoing, and from a range of market actors that are addressing these barriers. Among them, public donor financing initiatives like the MDCL, various technical assistance initiatives, such as Power Africa's work with MOE to set up independent power project units that can advise on and facilitate private-led investments into renewable energy, including solar. The ongoing tax exemptions on Lighting Global approved products, which are doing their part in facilitating imports, and efforts around quality standards, like the ACE Technical Assistance Facilities work with the Ethiopian Customs Commission to develop a customs handbook for solar products, and also various policy directives like NBE's recent draft directive that allows non-financial institutions for the first time to issue digital payment instruments, including mobile money, that will hopefully support PayGo. The list is not exhaustive. The full report goes into more detail and highlights other initiatives. But a key goal of the assessment with A-Staff and EMA was to outline opportunities for market efforts to be more coordinated and targeted moving forward. So when we look at some of the recommendations highlighted in the report, I think these can be explored in more detail in the panel session following, so I'll talk to them at a fairly high level. On the supply side, blended financing mechanisms have the potential to leverage both concessional, that is, forex loans, and local commercial capital. For example, if government lenders like DBE or CBE crowd in other commercial banks and take a first loss debt position, that reduces risk for smaller lenders. DBE is already bearing the full risk of consumer loans borrowed by MFIs under MDCL, but can extend this to, let's say, another iteration, extend it to a private sector credit line to bring in local banks that have pre-existing relationships with SAS companies. Also, to address those conservative collateral interest rates, some guarantee facilities that allow SAS companies to exchange cash guarantees for forex can reduce some of those steep collateral obligations and allow for a higher lending volume. Then thinking of the geographical challenges involved in creating new off-grid connections, results-based financing mechanisms can encourage companies to extend their supply chain to more remote areas. In the report, we describe how these RBFs can take the form of benefits to the companies themselves before or after the fact, or as a direct benefit to the consumer. And then also having some continuance of proven financing mechanisms like MDCL is also important to address forex issues, especially for as long as the NBE restrictions remain in place. And then more broadly, just to increase sector transparency and investor confidence in what is currently a fairly opaque market. It'll also be critical to build some data tracking capabilities so that key stakeholders can generate and leverage accurate and recent data on new off-grid connections, installations across product types and product sizes and so on, to highlight those investment opportunities. And on the data front, data on active SAS operators and their technical capacity is also important to determine any technical assistance and investment needs. And then here on the last slide, looking at some of the demand side interventions, there needs to be some increased capacity of the local manufacturing industry to reduce the sector's reliance on imports, especially given forex restrictions and fragmentation within the supply chain. There's a range of considerations that have to be taken into account to build that domestic capacity, like having reliable access to grid electricity, having complementary investment in component manufacturing of parts like batteries and panels and so on. And over time, Ethiopia could potentially position itself as a regional manufacturing hub to serve other fast-growing SAS markets, maybe in East and Central Africa. Enabling vertical integration will also be key in reducing that dependence on forex and supporting PAYGO, and exploring some alternative financing mechanisms like remittances, for example, given Ethiopia's large diaspora population, can offer some new consumer financing linkages. I think there's something being done around this with Power Africa. And then finally, on the policy side, liberalizing the mobile money industry to start to shift away from that bank-led model and open up the market to more competitive players like telcos and fintechs, can enable the growth of mobile payments and PAYGO. And since that PAYGO market is still fairly nascent in Ethiopia, there's also opportunity to build a knowledge base among early entrants into that model that can continue to serve the market as it grows. And lastly, on the tax and standards front, is someone asking a question? Okay. On the tax and standards end, the sector can really benefit from improved interagency collaboration, for example, between the Ethiopian Standards Authority, the Ministry of Trade and Industry, which oversees quality verification, customs authorities, and even regional energy bureaus or REBs, which are acting in some parts of the country to restrict the supply of low quality solar products, and which can be further leveraged to start to monitor and report on distribution activities and help bridge some of these administrative capacity gaps in local government. So those are most of the key outtakes from the full report. As mentioned at the outset, the report goes into more extensive detail into this information. I believe it's now available online. I'll leave it to Eden to share more about accessing it. I'm happy to take any questions, or Eden, if you prefer, we can also wait until after the panel session. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Joe, for the presentation. For me, the key findings would be, there is a massive opportunity for the off-grid sector. In Ethiopia, 90 million people are not electrified, and the Ethiopia government plans to reach majority of the population through off-grid solutions. So there is a massive opportunity. However, private companies are not to tap into this opportunity because of the forex issue and some monetary restrictions. So government of Ethiopia, especially Ministry of Energy, needs to play a key role in addressing these key challenges. But on the meantime, donors are also playing a key role by providing credit facilities, and a good example Joe has indicated was the collaboration with World Bank and Development Bank of Ethiopia, and providing a 40 million credit facility for solar companies. Not only that, but also to consumers through MFIs by providing loans to consumers to provide solar products. So thank you, Joe, for the great presentation. You can find this report on the A-Staff website as well as Shell Foundation website. As I have mentioned this, we've done this project jointly with the Ethiopian Energy Market Accelerator Program. So I'll move into the second session, which is I will invite our panelists. We'll have a quick discussion on what are the key challenges related to access to finance, especially it's been mentioned about the forex issue, and I would like to invite our first panelist, Ahmeddin, to introduce himself and this program. Thank you.
Thank you, Eden. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ahmeddin Ahmed. I lead the Ethiopian Energy Market Accelerator Program here in Ethiopia. Just to give a brief overview of the program, it's a joint initiative of Shell Foundation and Precise Consult International. It's an off-grid energy access program with an objective of accelerating access to energy for Ethiopians through market-based solutions. It essentially works on 4 key pillars: access to finance, specifically grant finance, enabling the environment, improving the enabling environment, access to information in terms of sector transparency and knowledge insight, also tackling the forex challenge, which is a structural challenge here in Ethiopia. I'm glad to join all of you in this session today, and I'm also glad to partner with ACE Technical Assistance Facility to jointly publish the Ethiopian Investment Market Map. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmeddin. Great to have you in this discussion. I would like to also invite our second panelist, Mr. Sahela from Ministry of Water, Irrigation and Energy, to introduce himself and the ministry.
Okay, thank you. I'm Saleh Tosfai from Ministry of Water, Irrigation and Energy. I'm senior energy expert, and I think in the in Ethiopia, the private sector has given much priority following the development plan of Ethiopia, because the Ethiopia government has given a priority for development and for development energies needed, so that if you look to the growth and transformation plan of Ethiopia, renewable energy has given an emphasis. So in order to make renewable energy access in Ethiopia, the private sector has to participate, and the participation of the private sector needs much support. So there are different tasks that are done by the government, and if you look to the National Electrification Program, it is designed as a result-based program which finances the private sector, and access to finance is created in order to reach the rural area, especially by providing many solar products in the off-grid areas, because as you know, the rural areas do not have any access in especially electricity access, so that this is given much priority in different private sectors, especially for solar companies and other especially private sectors, so that another priority is given for solar, because solar has given the priority, so that foreign currency are located by the government, and with the World Bank even, there are many experiences that we have got. So many solar companies are now participating and at least reach to the rural area, especially. So now we are also designing a credit facility through Development Bank of Ethiopia to provide foreign currency for solar importers, for our distributors, so that this makes some difference. And we are also collaborating with Africa Development Bank, and we are going to, I think, avail from $50 to $100 million funding through Development Bank of Ethiopia, so that the efforts that are made by the government are very crucial, and the private sector participation has given much emphasis. Even now, we are discussing the energy policy, and in the energy policy, even the private sector participation have given much emphasis, and much support will be expected from the government. Thank you.
Thank you, Ato Sahle, for briefly explaining the government policies towards universal electrification, and also for indicating that the private sector will play a key role. And with that, I would also like to invite Nabil, Vice Chairman of the Ethiopian Standards Association. Nabil, can you kindly introduce yourself and the association? Thank you. Nabil, we can't hear you. Can please unmute your mic. Okay, I'm thinking he's having some connection issues. I've seen him joining the meeting, so we'll invite him when he joins. So I will now like to forward my first question to Ahmedin from the Ethiopian Energy Market Accelerator. And my question is, how can solar manufacturing mitigate the forex challenges, and what is needed to scale solar manufacturing in Ethiopia? I know this was one of the recommendations in the investment map, in terms of reducing reliance on import and encouraging local manufacturing. So if you can share your perspective on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Eden, for that question. Indeed, forex is a structural challenge for Ethiopia, and in order to achieve universal access, the forex issue has to be resolved and mitigated. And one way to tackle this structural issue is through local value addition and manufacturing. It can partly address the forex challenge. And if we look at the recent global solar market trend report, 20% of SHS manufacturing cost is installation, which is essentially labor, wiring, and SHS housing. Those can be localized and can be manufactured here. And based on this 20% estimate of installation manufacturing cost, our internal analysis estimates that $61 million can be saved from solar manufacturing here in Ethiopia from 2022 to 2025. This is a significant number, and this forex saving, the $61 million, is equivalent to electrifying an additional 400,000 households. It's an equivalent to the forex needed to electrify 400,000 households. So it's a promising area. It can partly address the forex challenge. And to scale up manufacturing, there are a number of initiatives that need to be encouraged. One is to incentivize local manufacturers on better access to foreign currency so that they can import the necessary inputs. That's one. Also, it's to incentivize further local manufacturers on access to working capital. That's also another key, an important element to scaling up solar manufacturing. The third one is also enhancing and strengthening the local supply chain. Strengthening the local supply chain is essential to solar manufacturing. Within EMA, we started implementing a pilot to create business-to-business linkage between solar assemblers and manufacturers and local suppliers of inputs. For example, wire packaging can be locally manufactured, and that component, that cost of manufacturing can be localized. We've started implementing such pilots. Such pilots should be replicated and scaled up. So we see these three initiatives: access to forex, incentivizing solar manufacturers to get better access to forex, incentivizing further manufacturers to get better working capital finance, as well as strengthening the local supply chain, important components to scaling up solar manufacturing here in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmeddin. I believe it's very important to encourage manufacturing. Currently, we only have 2 to 3 manufacturers, and to scale up, we need to have those kind of B2B activities and support from government as well through different quality assurance mechanisms and incentives. So my second question goes to Joe. You briefly mentioned that the pay-as-you-go adoption scale in Ethiopia is very low. If you can share with us your perspective, how can this be scaled up in the context of Ethiopia?
Aiden, just to confirm your question, did you ask how pay-go can be better scaled up?
Yes.
Okay. So for pay-go, I think maybe the first thing to call out would be that there are already some policies that have been drafted that aim to create a more enabling environment for mobile payments and that will ultimately support PAYGO in the SAS sector. And that's the directive that I had mentioned earlier in the presentation that was issued by the National Bank of Ethiopia in March of 2020 that allows non-financial institutions to apply for licenses to issue payments instruments, including mobile money. Perhaps the first thing with regard to supporting increased scale of PAYGO would be addressing some constraints within that directive itself. I think the first one would be that it is contingent on payment providers putting up about 50 million Ethiopian ETB, equivalent to USD 1.6 million as a minimum requirement. It also doesn't extend to internationally owned companies, which is an understandable risk constraint given the government's focus on supporting locally owned companies. But it does limit the impact of the directive, of the policy, because most financial technology companies in Ethiopia seem to be foreign owned, at least from our research. So I think that would be one thing to call out. And then I think that the second would be definitely around vertical integration. It was mentioned, I think, by someone else as well that because of restrictions that require, for example, a retailer to only be engaged in retail activities or a manufacturer or distributor to operate solely within the function or part of the value chain in which they're active, really limits the adoption and scalability of PAYGO, because when we look at markets that have more robust and mature PAYGO models scaled up within SAS companies, we see that a recurring element is that these companies are vertically integrated. They own their supply chain end to end, from manufacturing all the way to after sales support, because they're able to manage costs closely, which for PAYGO is important because as an SAS company, you're relying on longer receivables because customers are now taking 6 months or so to repay the cost of the product. And so managing costs is extremely important. So enabling that vertical integration would be a major step towards supporting PAYGO adoption and scale.
Thank you, Joe, for that valuable feedback. Recently, MOWI has also established a working group on digital payments to really assess what can be done to scale up pay-as-you-go, and we'll make sure that these recommendations are reviewed and incorporated. So before I move into my other questions, for participants, if you have any question, please type it on the chat box, and then we will address those questions. So I will move into the Ministry of Water and Irrigation, to Ato Sahela. You mentioned briefly about the work you are doing with World Bank and African Development Bank in terms of providing a forex credit facility for solar businesses. So can you briefly give us more detail? I know this is part of the National Electrification Plan, which you want to have universal electrification access by 2025, and to reach that target, the ministry has been working closely with development partners as well, and one of this program is a credit facility you're working with World Bank and FDB. So if you can give us a little bit more information, and if you have also suggestions on how other development partners could be part of this facility. Over to you, Ato Sahel.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Aidan. I think we have a good experience in especially distributing solar, especially for the rural areas. This is done by giving an opportunity for the private sector, and the World Bank, the Ministry of Water and Energy has allocated a fund and works with the World Bank about $40 million, and this is given in different times for the private companies to import solar products. So these solar products are, of course, certified solar products that are distributed in each region. So even the solar companies will report the place where they have been distributed, so that it is a good experience that we have got, and we want to escalate this experience for the next time. Even the private sectors are now increasing in their numbers for their participation. So even the World Bank has given much assistance on this, and it will allocate even more on this. Even we are working, as I mentioned, the Africa Development Bank is also working with us, and we are also, I think we'll distribute this one, but the experience that we have is the best experience, and we'll, I think, replicate this one and make it more, and because if you look to our plan is at least to make 100% electrification. So this will be done in the next time. So I think this is a good experience that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ato Sahale, for sharing that. Definitely, the Development Bank credit facility was definitely a success, and it's been replicated in certain markets as well. The ministry is also working with the USA program on remittance projects, so it's also interesting to see the ministry is looking into different financial instruments. It's also looking at result-based financing and blended finance. So we're expecting a lot of projects coming up recently, especially under the NIP program. Now I will move into Ahmeddin, and my question would be, what do you think is the role of grant capital in achieving universal access, and what can be done to mobilize additional catalytic capital to the Ethiopia OGS market?
Thank you, Eden, for that question. Yes, indeed, catalytic capital plays an important role to accelerating access to energy in Ethiopia, in addition to the commercial capital. If we take, for example, PAYGO, which is essential to achieving universal access, catalytic capital plays a role in de-risking and validating some of those PAYGO business models that will eventually crowd in more commercial capital to scale PAYGO businesses here in Ethiopia. So a recent Shell Foundation study on catalytic and grant capital estimated that in addition to a larger commercial capital estimate, Ethiopia will need $106 million of catalytic and grant capital to achieve universal access. So this is a significant funding requirement, and currently a shortfall. So there needs to be a concerted effort to help unlock this catalytic capital to the Ethiopian off-grid sector. EMA, or the Ethiopian Energy Market Accelerator, has been engaging various catalytic investors to understand some of the challenges they're facing in deploying catalytic investment into the sector. One was defined investable opportunities in terms of understanding where catalytic capital will make the most impact in accelerating universal access in Ethiopia. That's why such reports, the likes of the Ethiopian investment market map, help investors to make to inform the decisions of catalytic investors. Second is EMA has also been coordinating convening of funders and has created funders working group to kind of synergize their investment into the off-grid sector so that its impact is more magnified and duplication of effort is avoided. So such initiatives are required, coordinating access to information and clearly defined investable opportunities are essential to help unlock more catalytic investment, essentially the $106 million catalytic investment into the sector. Also, government further understanding of government's priorities in terms of where it's important to deploy catalytic capital to accelerate and achieve universal access. So these are, in summary, what I think could be important. Back to you, Eden.
Thank you, Ahmedine, for that. So my last question goes to Joe. So it's been mentioned a number of times that a lot of investment is needed in the sector, and one way of addressing this is opening up the market to foreign companies. And in your report, it indicates that foreign companies are not able to enter into the market. So if you can share with us your insight, how do you think this has impacted the sector, and how do you propose the government should address? Does the report recommend, for example, gradual opening up of the sector through joint venture? What's your recommendation towards liberalization of the sector?
Thanks, Eden. There's an see. Hi, can you hear me clearly? Okay. So around foreign-owned companies, the restrictions that they face entering the market, and then the impact that this has on investment into the sector. In the report, we look mostly at how the foreign currency restrictions are actually providing a competitive edge for foreign-owned companies and acting as a disadvantage for locally owned companies. So when you look at private sector investment that has come into Ethiopia, most of it has been through investments into internationally owned companies. Thinking about companies like NG Mobisol that recently merged, Azuri, D-Light, Greenlight Planet, all of which have raised various forms of commercial capital to support their operations across multiple countries, Ethiopia inclusive. And so these are the countries that are then able to come in, these are the companies that are then able to come in with funding to scale their operations to, assuming restrictions continue to be lifted around PAYGO, to start adopting those PAYGO models. Whereas locally owned companies have been mostly restricted to equity funding in the form of family and friends investments, or to grant financing through facilities like AECS React or other NGOs like the Ethiopia Climate Innovation Center. So I think that's from our report and our analysis, the take on how these restrictions around foreign companies and their entry into the market plays out, and the impact that it's having on investment into the space. Does that answer the question, Eden?
Yes, thank you for that. So now I'll open the floor to any questions from participants. Okay, Amir? Wandemu, sorry.
Okay, thank you so much for the, can you hear me maybe?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for the brief and for the facility that you make us to reach in this very critical time. And my question is with the forex related to forex in Ethiopia. How much funding is there, and is that already released? Because we used to hear about this funding previously, and then now what is the status? And again, how about the collateral requirement to be engaged in this opportunity? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Wandemu. Ahmeddin, do you want to take that or?
Sure. Thank you, Wandemo, for that insightful question. Starting from your second question, collateral requirement is one of the challenge for solar enterprises here in Ethiopia to accelerate their work to energy access. So it's prohibitive in terms of it's more than the amount to be dispersed. So it's above 100% collateral is required for solar enterprises. So this is a significant challenge. At the moment, the collateral challenge has not yet been resolved, but one potential opportunity to tackle this collateral requirement is through receivable-based financing and using inventory as collateral to finance solar enterprises. This could partly address the collateral challenge. Another is also catalytic capital being used to as a guarantee mechanism for solar enterprises to borrow more commercial capital. So these are some of the potential solutions that can address these collateral requirements. As far as the funding is in terms of committed fund to date, the investment report details that the numbers, the actual number committed to date in terms of the NEP requirement, in terms of in order to achieve universal access by 2025, an amount explicitly is there. And so far, I think 400 million or so is committed, but once you get the report, you will have a clear number around how much is committed and how much is the gap.
Okay, thank you for that. Wandemu, that's also a great question. Collateral has been, a very one of the key challenges, especially even with the DB facility, because their collateral requirement was high. So, for example, in the previous case, what I did was the NDP provided a 5 million collateral guarantee facility, so that the guarantee requirement would only drop down to 25%, and the upcoming projects will also consider, providing collateral guarantee, because we need to also encourage new businesses to enter into this market, because we only have a small number of private companies, compared to markets like Kenya and Uganda. Victor? Yeah. Wandemu, I hope we have answered you.
Eden?
Yeah. Yes,
sorry,
Victor.
sorry to cut you off. sorry to cut you off. We really need to go back to the main meeting. We can finish the conversations on the other side. Please, let's all go back to the other side because we have run out of time and the other team is already there waiting for us.
Okay, thank you, Victor. So, Robbie and Andrea, if you can type your questions on the chat box, me and my team will definitely get back to you. I hope for all participants, I hope you have found these discussions very useful. This is one of the first discussions we'll have, in terms of improving access to finance, because, in Ethiopia, that's one of the key challenges in the sector, and we hope this investment map will provide you some insights. So thank you for listening, and as Victor said, we can now move into the others, to the previous session, just to finalize and wrap up. Thank you. Bye.
Hello. Welcome.